Before punk exploded, before alternative rock filled arenas, before indie became cool, there was the Velvet Underground. They didn't chase hits. They didn't follow trends. They ignored them. And in doing so, they changed everything. But behind their cool detachment was chaos, tension, addiction, betrayal, and genius colliding in the dim light of Andy Warhol's Factory. How did a band that failed commercially in the 60s become the blueprint for every rebellion that came after? This isn't just a story about music. It's about truth, about art that refused to lie, and the strange, beautiful accident that rewired rock forever. In 1964, America's radios sounded like candy. The Beatles were charming the world with polished harmonies. Motown ruled the charts with perfect pop craftsmanship. California was dripping in sun and psychedelic dreams. Every song on the radio promised love, hope, and escape. But, on the other side of that perfect picture, the streets told a different story. New York City wasn't the land of peace and love. It was a collage of noise, neon, and nervous energy. Crime was rising, artists were broke, and the dream of the American 60s was already cracking. Beneath the clean surface of mainstream pop, people were feeling something darker: isolation, addiction, and restlessness. Quick reality check. Meanwhile, across town, in a cheap apartment in the Lower East Side, a young man named Lou Reed was writing songs about people no one else dared to sing about. Drug users, drag queens, the lonely, the lost. He wasn't chasing radio hits, he was writing about real life. Hold that sound in your head. Now add something no one expected. Across the Atlantic, in Wales, another restless soul was experimenting with sound itself. John Cale, classically trained but bored with tradition, had come to America to study avant-garde composition. He was deep into drone music, minimalism, and the strange possibilities of repetition. Where Reed saw words as weapons, Cale saw noise as freedom. Here's the piece almost everyone misses. When Lou Reed and John Cale met in New York in 1964, the musical world didn't have a place for them. Record labels wanted safe. Pop culture wanted pretty. But what these two were building was the opposite of pretty. It was raw, strange, and dangerously honest. Quick reality check. The mid-1960s weren't all flower power. The civil rights movement was clashing with police brutality. The Vietnam War was dividing generations. Artists, poets, and musicians in New York's underground were rejecting the fantasy of the mainstream. They weren't looking for peace and love. They were looking for truth. Lou Reed was already pushing boundaries at Pickwick Records, churning out quick novelty songs for small paychecks, secretly slipping dark lyrics into upbeat tunes. He was living a double life, pop by day, underground poet by night. John Cale, meanwhile, was performing with avant-garde pioneers like LaMonte Young, exploring how long a single note could live. Hold that contrast. Commercial versus experimental. Structure versus chaos. When these two collided, something electric happened. They fused storytelling with sound manipulation. Lou brought the street language. Cale brought the drone and discipline. The formula wasn't built for the charts. It was built for revolution. And they weren't alone. Around them, New York's art scene was boiling over. Filmmakers, poets, painters, and rebels were gathering at the Factory, the creative nerve center of Andy Warhol's world. It was here that ideas, like noise, had no boundaries. You could be anything. You could say everything. Here's the piece that connects it all. Before anyone had heard the Velvet Underground, the parts were already dangerous. Lou Reed's words, John Cale's sound, the city's tension, the art world's rebellion. They weren't born from the music industry, they were forged in basement clubs, art studios, and sleepless New York nights. So by the time anyone knew the name The Velvet Underground, the fuse had already been lit. And what came next would blow open the boundaries of what music could be. The story really begins in a cramped, dim rehearsal space somewhere in downtown Manhattan. A handful of musicians, half broke and half brilliant, are trying to make something that doesn't sound like anything on the radio. Lou Reed strums a sharp, simple rhythm. John Cale lets his bow drag across the strings of his electric viola until it screeches. The room shakes. Someone stops and laughs. Not because it's funny, but because it's alive. After that night, the room tilted. The first time they played together, it didn't sound like a new band. It sounded like a weapon. Quick reality check. This wasn't some label audition or industry showcase. They were just trying to make something honest. The band was still finding its form. Lou Reed on vocals and guitar, John Cale on viola and bass, Sterling Morrison on guitar, and Maureen Moe Tucker on drums, her minimalist, standing-up style giving the music a heartbeat that was more pulse than polish. Freeze the frame. Listen to that sound one more time. It's the sound of tension made musical. Noise and melody crashing into each other, neither willing to step back. Then came the break they didn't expect. One night, a friend introduced them to a man who wasn't a musician at all, but an artist who understood performance like few others. His name was Andy Warhol, and his world was a living experiment. Inside the factory, his silver-wrapped studio, art, film, and chaos collided daily. Warhol saw in the Velvet Underground what the music industry couldn't: raw energy, danger, and something completely new. Here's the piece almost everyone misses. Warhol didn't just discover them, he framed them. He made them part of a larger art statement. He turned their sound into an experience, and with his backing, doors started opening that no label executive could have ever imagined. Hold that sound in your head. Now add a voice. Warhol introduced them to Nico, a German singer and model with a deep, haunting tone that sounded like it came from another world. Her voice, detached yet magnetic, softened and sharpened their music all at once. Lou Reed didn't love the idea at first, but it worked. Together, they created a sound that felt like walking through the city at 2 a.m., beautiful and terrifying at the same time. In 1966, Warhol produced their live multimedia show called The Exploding Plastic Inevitable. It wasn't just a concert, it was an assault on the senses. Strobe lights, film projections, dancers, and noise filled the air. The audience didn't know whether to dance or run. Some did both. Freeze the frame again. People didn't talk during Velvet Underground shows. They either watched in stunned silence or left the room. The band wasn't asking for your approval. They were daring you to look away. And then came the recording that detonated everything. In 1967, the Velvet Underground and Nico arrived, a banana on the cover, designed by Warhol. Inside, 11 songs that tore the polite fabric of rock apart. I'm Waiting for the Man, Venus in Furs, Heroin, All Tomorrow's Parties, songs that refused to hide behind metaphors. The first time critics heard it, they didn't know what to say. Some called it noise, others called it filth, most just ignored it. But the few who got it, really got it. Numbers don't tell it, This clip does. The record barely sold, but in every small club, every art school, and every underground bar, kids were passing the word around. You need to hear this. And then the backlash landed. Radio stations refused to play it. Big labels wanted nothing to do with it. Yet, in a strange twist, their rejection became their identity. The Velvet Underground wasn't trying to be popular. They were trying to be real. And that truth, though it scared the mainstream, lit a fire in the next generation of outsiders. Here's the piece that connects it all. Warhol's vision gave them a platform, but the band's defiance gave them immortality. Together, they created not just songs, but a new way to think about music, as art, as rebellion, as truth. And behind the curtain, tension was already building. Reed and Cale's chemistry was electric and volatile. Two geniuses, two visions, one impossible balance. Because when you build something that loud, something that raw, something that fearless, eventually it explodes. They weren't just selling music, they were selling permission. The Velvet Underground gave kids a new language, a new uniform, and a way to be loud in a world that wanted them quiet. In 1967, when the Velvet Underground and Nico hit the shelves, it didn't look like any other record. A bright yellow banana designed by Andy Warhol on a plain white cover. Peel it, and underneath, the word peel slowly, and see. It was more than a design. It was an invitation. Inside was music that peeled away every layer of illusion pop music had built. Freeze the frame. Listen to that opening riff on I'm Waiting for the Man. It's not polished. It's not pretty. It's relentless. A pounding rhythm that feels like the sound of a subway car grinding down the tracks. Moe Tucker's drumming is primitive and hypnotic. No cymbal crashes, just the steady hit of mallets on toms and a bass drum. Sterling Morrison's guitar weaves through Lou Reed's sharp rhythm, while John Cale's piano hammers out that tense, unsettling pulse. That's their secret weapon, the one-note drone. The Velvet Underground used repetition the way painters use color, to hypnotize you, to make you stare longer than you should. Now, solo the lyrics. I'm waiting for my man, $26 in my hand. Reed wasn't hiding behind metaphors. He was telling you about a heroin buy in Harlem, straight and unfiltered. In a time when the radio was full of sunshine and psychedelic escapism, that honesty felt like a slap to the face. Quick reality check. While San Francisco was singing about peace and love, the Velvet Underground was singing about needles, desire, and self-destruction. And that's why parents complained. But kids listened closer. Because for some, it felt like someone was finally saying the quiet parts out loud. Heroin, maybe their most controversial song, didn't glamorize addiction. It showed its seduction and its horror in the same breath. The rhythm builds like a heartbeat, faster, faster, until it bursts into chaos, then falls back into silence. It's not a song you listen to. It's one you survive. One studio trick you can't unhear after this. John Cale's electric viola doesn't play melody. It screams. He bowed it through amplifiers and distortion pedals, turning classical technique into raw noise. That shriek became the ancestor of punk feedback, industrial drone, and every underground experiment that followed. And that's why copycats never quite felt right. They could imitate the noise, but not the meaning. Hold that sound in your head. Now add the voice of Nico. Her deep, icy tone on Femme Fatale and all tomorrow's parties turned pop femininity upside down. While other singers chased sweetness, Nico sounded detached, tragic, almost ghostly. It made every word sound like prophecy. They looked different, too. Reed in black shades and leather, Nico's aloof beauty, Cale's art school intensity. They weren't dressing for fame. They were dressing for survival. Their image was cool because it was careless. Kids copied the look before they even understood the songs. Here's the piece almost everyone misses. Their controversy wasn't just lyrical, it was cultural. They blurred lines between art and music, sexuality and gender, beauty and ugliness. In the factory, where Warhol projected films behind their shows, the band became living performance art. You didn't just hear the Velvet Underground, you experienced them. And then came the backlash. Critics called them vulgar, unlistenable, even dangerous. Some venues banned them outright. But underground writers and young musicians whispered their name like a secret code. The mainstream said, "Turn it down." The kids said, "Turn it up." The Velvet Underground's power came from contradiction. Noise and silence, chaos and precision, art and reality. Reed's rhythm guitar drove like a heartbeat. Morrison's lines grounded the storm. Cale's viola tore holes in the air. And Tucker's drumming reminded you that this chaos had order. Pull any one of them out, and the whole machine falls apart. Solo the bass line in Venus in Furs. Hear that slow, dragging groove? It's the pulse of the record, hypnotic and dangerous. It doesn't move fast, it lurks. That's how their songs worked. They didn't rush to the chorus. They drew you in. They weren't trying to sound like the future. They were trying to sound true. And that truth, ugly and beautiful, became the foundation for nearly every alternative movement that followed. Punk, post-punk, noise rock, indie, because here's what made them so dangerous. The Velvet Underground didn't care if you liked them. They only cared if you felt them. And once you did, there was no going back. By the end of the 60s, their shows were small, their sales even smaller. But underground scenes were buzzing. Artists, poets, and kids with guitars started thinking differently about what music could be. The myth had already begun. Because when you tell the truth loud enough, even if no one's listening, the world eventually catches up. Behind every myth, there's a mess. Behind the banana cover, the cool shades, and the New York street poetry, there was exhaustion, confusion, and a slow unraveling that nobody could stop. By the end of the 1960s, the Velvet Underground had become everything and nothing at once. Cult heroes in the art world, ghosts on the radio, and broke in real life. Let's sit with that for a second. Their records barely sold. The Velvet Underground and Nico had been banned in stores. White Light and White Heat scared off radio stations, and The Velvet Underground, their third album, the one with the quiet songs and broken hearts, found almost no audience when it came out. Lou Reed once said, "We were ahead of our time, but the rent was still due." The grind was brutal. Endless touring in small clubs. Long drives in vans that broke down more often than they ran. Constant fights with labels who didn't understand them. MGM signed them, then dropped them. Verve Records wanted hits. The band gave them feedback and heroin confessions. And money? Almost none. They were artists living on fumes, sleeping on couches, chasing small checks that came too late. Then came the human toll. Lou Reed, already sharp and guarded, began to break down under the pressure. He'd been taking speed to get through shows and tranquilizers to sleep afterward. His mood swung from charming to venomous. John Cale, his closest collaborator, was just as intense, obsessed with sound experiments that pushed their music into stranger, darker corners. Their creative tension had been the spark that made them great, until it became the fire that burned them out. By mid-1968, Lou had had enough. He told Warhol he was out. Just like that, the band's art guardian, the man who gave them a stage and a myth, was gone. And Nico, whose voice had made their debut unforgettable, drifted into her own solo world of European darkness and heroin addiction. That left Reed and Cale, and the room between them was getting smaller. One night, after another argument over control, Reed gave an ultimatum. It's him or me. The next day, Cale was gone. Just like that, half the soul of the Velvet Underground vanished. Listen to the records before and after. You can hear the split. Before, it's chaos and drone, danger and distortion. After, it's quiet, fragile, almost tender. Songs like Pale Blue Eyes and Candy Says sound like Reed talking to ghosts, and, maybe, to himself. The band that once shocked the world with noise had turned inward, whispering their pain instead of screaming it. But that calm didn't mean peace. By 1970, they were still struggling. Gigs in small venues, label changes, no money, no promotion. Lou Reed was exhausted. He'd poured everything into the band, and still the world didn't care. One night after a show, he simply walked away. No grand statement, no big goodbye. He packed his guitar, left the stage, and went home to Long Island to work in his father's office. The Velvet Underground continued briefly without him, but without Reed, it wasn't real anymore. That's the thing about revolutions. They rarely end with fireworks. They end with silence. Behind the posters was a price tag. Sleep, blood, sanity. Reed's breakdown, Cale's departure, Nico's addiction, each one a fracture that changed the chemistry. Most acts fade slowly. The Velvet Underground didn't fade. They detonated. And that's why the legend froze young instead of growing safe. We're going to sit with that for a second. Because the story could have ended there. A failed band, forgotten by the charts. But something strange was already happening underground. In the 1970s, in small rehearsal rooms and grimy clubs, young musicians were listening. They didn't hear failure. They heard freedom. They didn't hear sadness. They heard truth. Brian Eno famously said, "The Velvet Underground didn't sell many records, but everyone who bought one started a band." And he wasn't exaggerating. David Bowie carried their spirit into glam rock, the androgyny, the darkness, the street poetry. Patti Smith and television took their raw honesty to CBGB, birthing punk. The Ramones stripped their drone into speed. Sonic Youth worshipped their noise. The Strokes, Arctic Monkeys, and generations of indie bands copied that same minimalist cool. The Velvet Underground had gone from being ignored to being everywhere. Even Reed and Cale, apart, carried the torch in different ways. Reed chased rock stardom with Transformer and Walk on the Wild Side, wrapping velvet grit in glam shine. Cale dove deep into avant-garde music, working with Brian Eno and inventing new textures for the future. Their paths were different, but the DNA was the same. What was once underground had become influence. What was once noise had become blueprint. And maybe that's the irony. The Velvet Underground were too real for their own time. But their honesty became timeless. They taught every generation after them that music didn't need to please to matter. It just needed to tell the truth. And that truth always finds a way to surface. By the time the 1990s rolled around, the Velvet Underground were no longer a secret. Critics and historians finally caught up with what the fans had known all along. This band, once ignored and scorned, had rewritten the rules of rock music. Spot the lineage. Listen to David Bowie glide across Queen Bitch, nodding to their minimalist cool. Hear the raw feedback and hypnotic bass of Sonic Youth? That's Cale and Reed's DNA, pulsing decades later. The Ramones' stripped-down punk aggression owes its pulse to a band that could scare with just a guitar and a drum beat. One sample you've heard 1,000 times is hidden in hip-hop, electronic music, and indie rock. That slow, deliberate bass line from Venus in Furs has echoed across genres, borrowed, flipped, and honored without most listeners even knowing. And it wasn't just sound. The look, the attitude, the refusal to care about approval. Kids copied it, subcultures lived it, and new art movements thrived in its shadow. Velvet Underground didn't just influence bands, they seeded entire genres: proto-punk, art punk, noise rock, alternative, and indie. Quick reality check: their influence didn't stop when the band dissolved. Archival reissues, tribute albums, and documentaries ensured the music stayed alive. Every decade has seen a resurgence. 1980s art punks discovering the first LP on cassette. 1990s indie kids spinning White Light, White Heat. 2000s college students sampling Cale's viola drones. And now, in 2025, anyone with a streaming account can step into their world instantly. Okay, your pick goes in the pinned playlist. Start with The Velvet Underground and Nico. Hear Sunday Morning and understand why a simple percussion and Reed's delicate voice could feel like a revolution. Then move to White Light, White Heat, and let The Gift, or Sister Ray, shake your concept of what a rock song can even be. And that's why they still matter. Music today is built on layers of rebellion, experimentation, and honesty. The Velvet Underground showed that art doesn't have to be safe, that being real is braver than being popular, and that failure can turn into legend if your vision is true. Listen to the tempo. It's slower now, reflective, but heavy with impact. From underground clubs to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction in 1996, from Warhol's Factory to Spotify playlists, the echo of their influence never stopped. This is your invitation. If you weren't there in the 60s, now you know the story. The stage is set, the noise still resonates, and the blueprint is everywhere, waiting for the next listener to pick it up and carry it forward. Your turn. What was the first Velvet Underground song that hit you in the chest? Who should we deep dive next? This is Rock Lore. Subscribe so this history doesn't vanish into the algorithm, and hit the next episode where we trace another band that rewired music. Because every legend starts with someone daring to make the world uncomfortable. And remember, before the Velvet Underground, rock sounded safe. After them, everything became possible. Even if you've never heard the name, you're living in their echo. The journey doesn't end here, rock warrior. Watch this next.